Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the channel. Think you know who built Canada? Think again. We often hear about Sir John A. Macdonald and the moment of Confederation in 1867 like it was a proud, unified leap into nationhood. But behind the speeches and ceremonies was a tangled web of ambition, rivalries, and compromise. This wasn't a clean, inevitable march toward independence. It was a series of calculated moves, desperate negotiations, and sometimes outright deception. In the background of every iconic moment, the signing of Confederation, the creation of provinces, the building of the transcontinental railway, there were powerful men jockeying for control, regions protecting their interests, and communities who were barely consulted at all. The maritime provinces feared being swallowed up. French Canada worried about losing its identity. Indigenous nations were excluded entirely, even though they had shaped the land for thousands of years. And looming over it all was the fear of American expansion, a fear that pushed reluctant colonies to unite not out of love, but out of necessity. This is the story you don't get in the textbooks. Not just the headlines, but the backroom meetings, the political deals sealed over whiskey and telegrams, the bitter debates that almost tore it all apart before it even began. In this series, we're peeling back the polished narrative to reveal the drama, the tension, and the hard choices that truly built Canada. Because the truth is, nations aren't born overnight, they're negotiated into existence. Before 1867, what we now call Canada was anything but a unified nation. It was a patchwork, a scattered, often divided set of British colonies, distinct Indigenous territories, and the remnants of French Canada, each with its own priorities, identities, and visions for the future. The very idea of Canada as a single entity didn't exist in practice. Instead, there were regions like Upper and Lower Canada, modern-day Ontario and Quebec, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, and Newfoundland, all functioning with varying degrees of autonomy and allegiance to the British Crown. The heart of this fragmented landscape were deep and persistent tensions. One of the most defining was the cultural and political divide between the British and French populations. In Quebec, French Canadians clung to their language, Catholic faith, and civil law traditions, fighting to preserve their identity in a system increasingly dominated by English-speaking Protestants. This wasn't just about culture, it was about power. The fear of assimilation, the push for equal representation, and resistance to British control led to repeated political deadlock and resentment. Overlaying this was the complex reality of Indigenous nations, who were neither passive observers nor willing participants in colonial schemes. For thousands of years, Indigenous peoples governed their own territories, maintained sophisticated systems of law and diplomacy, and engaged in trade across vast distances. As colonial expansion crept westward and treaties began to be signed, often under pressure or without informed consent, many Indigenous leaders resisted, asserting sovereignty and challenging the legitimacy of colonial claims. Their exclusion from the Confederation talks wasn't an oversight. It was a deliberate dismissal of their nationhood. Adding another layer of urgency to the colonial situation was the growing power of the United States. After the Civil War, American rhetoric around manifest destiny, an ideological belief that the U.S. was destined to expand across the continent, sent shockwaves through British North America. The fear of invasion or annexation loomed large, particularly after failed incursions like the Fenian raids. For many colonial leaders, uniting the provinces was not just about internal reform. It was a defensive strategy to create a stronger front against possible American aggression. The years leading up to Confederation were marked not by unity, but by fragmentation and uncertainty. There was no widespread public push for a Canadian nation as we know it today. No collective dream, binding coast to coast. Instead, there were competing identities, unresolved grievances, and a political landscape struggling to hold itself together. French Canadians, concentrated largely in Lower Canada, now Quebec, carried a deep fear that their language, religion, and civil law would be gradually eroded under British political dominance. Their experiences under colonial rule had already included forced assimilation efforts and a loss of autonomy after the British conquest of New France. Confederation, to many, looked less like partnership and more like absorption. Indigenous nations faced a different kind of marginalization. They had never surrendered their nationhood, and many had treaties or long-standing agreements with the British Crown. Yet as British settlers pushed westward, and the idea of uniting the colonies gained traction, Indigenous voices were not included in any major political conversations. Their land was being negotiated over as if it were empty, their governance systems ignored, and their sovereignty dismissed. What they experienced was not just exclusion, it was erasure from the national project being drafted. Meanwhile, in the Idaho maritime colonies, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, and Newfoundland, there was deep hesitation. These provinces had thriving trade networks with New England and often saw themselves as culturally and economically distinct from the central provinces of Canada West and Canada East. Many worried that joining a larger confederation would mean losing control over their local economies and being outvoted by the more populous inland regions. In some cases, there were strong anti-confederation movements, and in Newfoundland, it would take decades longer to join. All of this was taking place in the shadow of a United States that had just emerged from a brutal civil war. Its ideology of manifest destiny, the belief that it was destined to expand across the continent, was seen as a real and present danger. The British colonies feared being too weak and divided to fend off possible annexation. The American example also showed what could happen when unity failed, making Confederation appear, at least to some, as a necessary defense mechanism rather than a hopeful experiment in nation-building. In truth, Confederation was born not out of a sweeping national consensus, but from a mix of fear, political stalemate, and regional bargaining. It was a solution crafted by a handful of political elites trying to manage a crisis, not a popular movement rising from the people. And when the future of Canada was decided behind closed doors, many, particularly Indigenous peoples and minority communities, found themselves without a seat at the table. That legacy of exclusion would echo for generations to come. They're often called the Fathers of Confederation, but to truly understand how Canada came to be, you have to see these men not as statues or names in textbooks, but as real people, flawed, ambitious, and deeply shaped by their time. Their personalities clashed, their motives weren't always noble, and the path they forged was anything but straightforward. John A. Macdonald, often remembered as Canada's first Prime Minister, was a brilliant political strategist, known for his wit, charm, and ability to maneuver behind the scenes. But he was also a deeply controversial figure. His vision for Canada included the forced assimilation of Indigenous peoples, and his legacy is tied to policies like the residential school system. At the time, though, Macdonald was seen as a unifying force, someone who could hold together a country full of contradictions. He believed in a strong, centralized federal government and was willing to make backroom deals and concessions to get it. Then there was George-Étienne Cartier, Macdonald's essential partner from Quebec. Without Cartier, Confederation likely wouldn't have happened. A former revolutionary turned statesman, he was fiercely committed to protecting French-Canadian identity within the new country. He saw Confederation as a way to safeguard Quebec's culture, religion, and civil law from being swallowed by English majorities. But to do that, he had to compromise, sometimes supporting policies that weren't popular with his own people in exchange for securing political power in the new union. George Brown, by contrast, was Macdonald's longtime rival. A staunch reformer, and the founder of the Globe newspaper, Brown was a champion of representation by population, a system that would give more power to Ontario as it grew. He was suspicious of French influence in government and had long criticized what he saw as the corruption and inefficiency of the existing political system. Yet in a surprising turn, he eventually joined forces with Macdonald and Cartier in what became known as the Great Coalition, putting aside years of personal and political animosity for the sake of building a united country. And then there was Thomas D'Arcy McGee, the Irish-born poet, rebel, and idealist. Once a fiery radical who fled to North America after participating in failed Irish uprisings, McGee transformed into a passionate advocate for Canadian unity. He envisioned a country where diverse cultures could coexist and thrive, a vision shaped by his own immigrant experience. But his outspoken rejection of Irish-American nationalism and Fenian violence made him enemies. In 1868, just a year after Confederation, he was assassinated, Canada's first political murder. These men weren't perfect heroes. They were deeply human, driven by ego, fear, idealism, and political necessity. They argued fiercely, made uneasy alliances, and compromised constantly. What united them wasn't a shared background or even a shared vision. It was a recognition that the British colonies couldn't survive alone. Their story is one of personality as much as policy, of backstage maneuvering and political theater. And in understanding who they really were, we start to see the real shape of Canada, not a country born from purity or consensus, but from conflict, contradiction, and compromise. The story of Confederation often gets told as a grand meeting of minds, a noble step toward nationhood. But behind the scenes, it was far messier, filled with private deals, political pressure, and more than a few glasses of brandy. The Charlottetown Conference of 1864, which is often hailed as the birthplace of Canada, wasn't even supposed to be about creating a country. The original agenda was a modest proposal to unite the maritime colonies, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Prince Edward Island, for economic and defensive reasons. But when politicians from the province of Canada, modern-day Ontario and Quebec, arrived uninvited with much bigger ambitions, everything changed. These delegates weren't just there to talk policy. They knew how to work a room. Lavish banquets, late-night drinking sessions, and side conversations became as important as the formal speeches. John A. Macdonald, already known for his charisma and his deep knowledge of parliamentary maneuvering, took center stage. He had a knack for making people feel heard, even when he was subtly guiding them toward his desired outcome. But he was also struggling with personal demons. His dependency on alcohol was an open secret. During these crucial meetings, he was often drinking heavily and yet still managed to maintain control and direction over the unfolding talks. Behind the cheerful toasts and speeches, serious political calculations were underway. The delegates knew they had to craft a union that appealed to very different regions: French-speaking Quebec, Protestant Ontario, skeptical Nova Scotia, and strategic New Brunswick. They negotiated over representation in Parliament, language, rights, control of infrastructure, and financial incentives. Macdonald was central to these negotiations, offering concessions to bring hesitant provinces on board while maintaining the central authority he believed a strong Canada required. But not everyone was convinced. Quebec had deep concerns about protecting its language, religion, and civil law system. The French-speaking population feared being outnumbered and outvoted in a new country dominated by English-speaking Protestants. George-Étienne Cartier worked tirelessly to ease these fears, pushing for constitutional protections and cultural autonomy. Nova Scotia, meanwhile, was wary of being absorbed into a larger political entity where its voice might be lost. Some leaders there were deeply opposed to joining Confederation, and when it eventually did join, it was more through political maneuvering and economic pressure than enthusiastic consent. Even among the strongest advocates for Confederation, compromise was the name of the game. Macdonald, for all his brilliance, was also known for shady deals and political patronage. Later, scandals like the Pacific Scandal would reveal just how blurred the lines could be between nation-building and corruption. But in Charlottetown, Quebec, and later London, where the final terms of the British North America Act were hammered out, his ability to build coalitions and bend rivals to his will was unmatched. The creation of Canada wasn't a single moment, or a sweeping wave of patriotism. It was a careful, calculated, and at times underhanded process. It was built not just in conference halls, but in whispered conversations, forged over meals and liquor, shaped by ego and ambition as much as vision. To understand Confederation is to look past the textbook version and see the flawed, fascinating people who made it happen, and the complicated compromises they struck in building a country that from the beginning was anything but simple. As Canada moved toward Confederation in 1867, a crucial and painful contrast was unfolding. While the political leaders of British North America were meeting behind closed doors to forge a new nation, the indigenous nations who had occupied and governed these lands for millennia were being systematically excluded from the conversation. These were not passive bystanders to history. They were sovereign nations with their own laws, governance structures, and territories. Many had treaties, alliances, and long-standing relationships with the Crown. Yet, when it came time to shape the country that would engulf their lands, they were left out of the room. The creation of Canada marked the beginning of a new era, not just for settlers and provinces, but for Indigenous peoples as well. And for them, it wasn't the birth of a hopeful new nation. It was the formalization of their marginalization. Confederation paved the way for policies that would attempt to erase their sovereignty, their cultures, and in many cases their very existence as distinct peoples. This exclusion wasn't incidental, it was strategic. The founders of Canada envisioned a nation built on European models, rooted in British parliamentary tradition and Christian Western ideals. Indigenous governance, values, and relationships to the land did not fit easily into that vision. In the years that followed, the Canadian government moved quickly to consolidate control over Indigenous lands. Treaties, many of which were negotiated under duress, misunderstanding, or outright deceit, became tools for transferring land to the Crown. The numbered treaties, signed from the 1870s onward, were framed by the government as peaceful agreements. But from an Indigenous perspective, these treaties were often coercive, stripped of real negotiation, and poorly honored once signed. Land, which Indigenous nations had always understood as communal and sacred, became something to be parceled out, fenced off, and sold. Then, in 1876, less than a decade after Confederation, the Indian Act was introduced, a sweeping piece of legislation that would govern almost every aspect of Indigenous life in Canada. It defined who was considered Indian, established the reserve system, and imposed a colonial governance structure on First Nations communities through band councils. It banned cultural practices, regulated movement, and set the stage for residential schools, which would go on to cause generational trauma. Under the Indian Act, Indigenous peoples were treated not as founding partners or autonomous nations, but as wards of the state, children in need of control, assimilation, and management. From the First Nations perspective, Confederation was not a moment of inclusion. It was a warning. It signaled a future in which their lands would be taken, their voices silenced, and their treaties ignored. Yet despite this, Indigenous peoples resisted. They petitioned, protested, negotiated, and preserved their identities against overwhelming odds. Oral histories passed down through generations speak not just of loss, but of resilience. For many Indigenous communities, Canada's founding is remembered not as a celebration, but as the start of a long and ongoing struggle for recognition, rights, and justice. This shift toward reckoning isn't just symbolic, it's essential. For too long, the dominant narrative of Canada's founding painted a picture of peaceful unification, of leaders coming together for the greater good. But that image dissolves when seen through the lens of Indigenous experience. Land acknowledgements are a first step. Public admissions that this land was not empty or freely given. But they are only meaningful if followed by action, honoring treaties, restoring land rights, and respecting Indigenous sovereignty. Movements like Idle No More, which erupted in 2012, were not isolated flare-ups. They were the product of centuries of resistance. They are part of a broader resurgence in Indigenous law, governance, and cultural identity. Across the country, Indigenous youth are reclaiming languages once banned. Elders are guiding communities through traditional practices once deemed illegal. And nations are asserting their inherent rights, not granted by Canada, but existing long before it. The story of Confederation, when told honestly, is not just about political genius or economic necessity. It is also about deliberate exclusion, imposed control, and cultural erasure. Acknowledging this does not weaken the idea of Canada, it strengthens it, because true reconciliation and nationhood cannot be built on myths. They must be rooted in truth. Only when we confront the full story, one that includes Indigenous voices, perspectives, and agency, can we begin to build a future that honors the richness and complexity of what Canada truly is. As Canada was laying the foundation of a new nation, shadows were already stretching across its legacy. One of the earliest and most infamous political scandals, the Pacific Scandal of 1873, rocked the fledgling country to its core. Prime Minister John A. Macdonald, hailed by many as the architect of Confederation, was exposed for accepting election funds from businessmen in exchange for the contract to build the Canadian Pacific Railway. This wasn't just political corruption. It revealed how power, profit, and patronage were tightly intertwined in shaping the country's infrastructure and future. Macdonald resigned in disgrace, though he would later return to power. Still, The scandal left a lasting stain and raised hard questions about the motivations behind the nation's grand projects. But beyond political corruption, the deeper moral failures of early Canada lie in its treatment of non-European peoples. As the new country expanded westward, it didn't just bring railways and settlers, it brought policies of exclusion and forced assimilation. One glaring example was the Chinese head tax, first imposed in 1885. Chinese laborers, many of whom had helped build the very railway Macdonald championed, were targeted with punitive fees simply to enter the country. These policies didn't end there. For decades, immigration laws and employment practices codified racial hierarchies, sending a clear message about who belonged in Canada and who didn't. Even more devastating was the treatment of Indigenous peoples. The Indian Act, passed in 1876, gave the federal government sweeping control over every aspect of Indigenous life, from land to identity to governance. It laid the groundwork for the residential school system, in which generations of Indigenous children were forcibly removed from their families, stripped of their languages, and subjected to abuse in the name of assimilation. These schools operated for more than a century, leaving trauma that is still deeply felt today. This dark side of nation-building forces us to ask, can we truly celebrate Canada's origins without acknowledging these injustices? Patriotism that ignores pain isn't unity, it's denial. If we're going to tell the story of Canada, we must tell all of it, the pride and the pain, the progress and the prejudice. Only by confronting these uncomfortable truths can we move forward with integrity toward a more honest and inclusive future. Confederation was a remarkable achievement in its time, a peaceful unification of disparate colonies into a single nation without war or revolution. The Founding Fathers managed to craft a framework that brought together English and French-speaking populations under one political system, allowed for regional autonomy, and set the stage for future expansion across a vast and diverse landscape. The British North America Act of 1867 laid down the architecture of a federal state that could, at least in theory, accommodate different languages, cultures, and interests. In this sense, they got something profoundly right. They recognized that unity in Canada would always require a degree of flexibility and compromise. But the Confederation they created was also built on exclusion and imbalance. Indigenous peoples were left entirely out of the process. Their sovereignty was ignored, their lands carved up, and their futures dictated without consent. French Canadians were brought in through the efforts of leaders like George-Étienne Cartier, but many still feared and would later experience cultural marginalization. English-speaking elites dominated the political and economic order, and their vision of Canada often clashed with others, especially in Quebec and the western provinces. The legacy of Confederation is one of duality. It created a country where two official languages were enshrined, yet linguistic tensions have repeatedly flared into political crises, most notably the rise of Quebec nationalism and two referendums on sovereignty. It fostered a sense of shared identity, but also deepened regionalism, with provinces like Alberta and Newfoundland often feeling alienated from decisions made in Ottawa. And while Canada today celebrates its multicultural identity, that ideal wasn't part of the original blueprint. It evolved through struggle, resistance, and activism. The inclusion of diverse cultures, the recognition of LGBTQ+ rights, and ongoing efforts toward gender equality were won not by the founding generation, but by later ones that challenged their limitations. Reconciliation remains one of the greatest, unfinished tasks left by the Confederation era. The idea that Canada can be a nation-to-nation relationship between Indigenous peoples and the Crown is still more aspiration than reality. The Founding Fathers laid the foundation, but they also set in motion injustices that have yet to be fully addressed. Their legacy, then, is complicated. They built a country with vision and determination, but also with blind spots and prejudices. To honor what they achieved and correct what they ignored, we must understand both what they got right and what they got wrong. Because only in that full picture can we truly understand what Canada was and what it still has the potential to become. The story of Confederation isn't just a dusty chapter in a history book. It's a living thread woven into the fabric of modern Canada. The same questions that haunted the founders, who belongs, whose voices matter, what holds this country together, are still being asked today. Immigration debates echo the tensions between integration and identity that existed from the very beginning. French-English dynamics continue to shape political discourse, particularly in Quebec, where sovereignty remains a live issue for many. The struggle for Indigenous rights, land recognition, and cultural survival is no longer happening in the shadows. It's front and center in courts, classrooms, and parliament. Truth and reconciliation efforts, including the acknowledgement of residential schools and the trauma they inflicted, are a direct response to the foundational choices made during Confederation, specifically, the decision to build a country without consulting or including Indigenous nations. Today's calls for land back, language revitalization, and treaty enforcement aren't just modern activism. They're the continuation of a fight that was ignored or silenced in 1867. Even the structure of Canadian federalism, how power is shared between provinces and the federal government, can be traced back to those early compromises. Modern issues like healthcare funding, environmental policy, and resource control often boil down to the same push and pull between national unity and provincial autonomy that shaped the original deal. Western alienation, for example, reflects the same regional frustrations that nearly kept some colonies out of Confederation in the first place. And then there's the idea of Canadian identity itself, often described as polite, multicultural, peaceful. But peel back the surface and you find debates over what it truly means to be Canadian, who gets to claim that identity, and how inclusive that identity really is. These are not new questions. They've been with Canada since before it was officially born. Revisiting Canada's origins with honesty and depth allows us to move beyond the sanitized versions often taught in classrooms, those that celebrate progress without questioning the cost. When we take a closer look at the roots of Confederation, we uncover the realities of exclusion, power struggles, and backroom politics that defined its creation. These weren't minor footnotes. They were central to how Canada was formed. Decisions were made behind closed doors, often by a small group of elites, without input from women, Indigenous nations, or many of the diverse communities already living on the land. These silences weren't accidental. They were deliberate. Omissions that shaped the nation's identity and governance from the outset. Understanding this helps explain many of the tensions still present today. The resistance of Indigenous peoples to colonial systems, the persistent questions around Quebec's place in Confederation, and the feeling of alienation among certain provinces. All of these are echoes of choices made in 1867. When power is concentrated and voices are excluded, the consequences are long-lasting. These aren't just historical injustices, they are living legacies that affect how people experience citizenship, justice, and opportunity in Canada now. Furthermore, recognizing that history isn't static, that it evolves as new voices are heard and new truths come to light, is crucial. The idea that Canada is still being built isn't just metaphorical, it reflects the ongoing nature of nationhood. Every debate about treaty rights, every policy aimed at equity, and every cultural expression that challenges dominant narratives is part of that continued construction. The past informs the present, but it doesn't have to define the future. By confronting the uncomfortable parts of history, we open space for real dialogue and meaningful change. We challenge myths that simplify a complex legacy and instead engage with the full spectrum of stories that make up Canada. This approach not only deepens our collective understanding, but also empowers us to shape a more inclusive, just, and honest national identity, one that honors the truth instead of hiding from it. The Founding Fathers were complex, heroes to some, villains to others. They dreamed of a united Canada, but the path they paved was built on compromises, exclusions, and hard truths. Understanding them, flaws and all, isn't about tearing down our history. It's about seeing it clearly, honestly, and fully. So now we turn it over to you. Who do you think was the real architect of Canada? Was it Macdonald, pulling the strings behind closed doors? Cartier, preserving French identity? Or were the true nation builders the ones left out of the story entirely? Indigenous leaders, unsung reformers, communities that shaped Canada from the margins? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Like and subscribe if you believe history deserves more than a headline. And don't miss the next video, where we take a deeper dive into the most controversial figure in Canadian history, John A. Macdonald, or explore the bold Indigenous resistance that challenged Confederation from the start. The real story of Canada is just beginning.